There's a pastor who ran into a gentleman with, every once in a while would show up at church, but hadn't shown up in a long while. And he said, this wandering member said to him, "Perhaps you've noticed, Pastor, that I've stopped coming to church." And he responded, "Yeah, I've certainly noticed that." He says, "Well, the reason I've stopped coming is because there's so many hypocrites there." And Pastor Riley replied, "Don't let that keep you away. There's always room for one more." For the first 5 weeks of the year, I'm answering questions that are often thrown the way of the church. A couple of weeks ago, we dealt with the question, can Jesus really be the only way to salvation? Last week, we answered the question, are science and faith truly at a continual state of warfare? And we ended that week with seeing that creation points us to the very glory of God. And the study of nature leads us to worship. It leads us to a responsibility that we can take for creation. And it leads us to a deeper appreciation and understanding of the majesty of God. And at the very end of the sermon, I said, okay, so what happens when creation goes wrong? And I said the next 2 Sundays this week, and even more so next week, we're going to answer that question. And next week we're going to start to look and ponder the question, how can God be good if we live in a world of suffering? We're going to start a little bit of that, answering that question today. So what happens when things go wrong, and particularly when things go wrong in the church? So we've certainly heard that accusation over time. They're just a bunch of hypocrites. I have a simple answer to that question. Is the church full of hypocrites? And the answer is yes. True. Guilty. No doubt about it. Absolutely. I will not argue it. I have no defense for anybody, and I certainly don't have a defense for myself. In a big corporate sense, many have said, well, look, churches, religions, start wars. And I would look at history and argue that it's not always true, and some of the wars that have been credited to the church maybe shouldn't have been, but that has happened. Some have brought up that churches have abused children, and I have no answer for that. Some have thrown in our face that you turn on the TV and you can watch some television evangelist who just uses their pulpit as a chance to sell their wares. Once again, there was a controversy this week where, didn't hit the news a lot in Canada, it certainly did in the States, though, of a well-known television evangelist who was answering letters that were sent to him. And one of the letters asked the question, how can I help my dad pay attention to my mom and care about my mom? And the TV evangelist, and I had to look it up and see if this is real, and I found it. And his reply is, well, you probably can't because your wife or your mom probably isn't pretty enough. I don't have an answer for why some people say things that they do. And to a point, you know what? I can't help some of those big issues. I can't judge or speak to some things that sometimes appear in the media. And the media, fairly or unfairly, usually unfairly, treats faith in a certain light, and I don't know. And I'm stuck because sometimes the media might portray somebody of faith saying something or doing something, and people in the world see that, and they automatically judge me, assuming that I would say the same thing or believe the same thing. And I cannot change some of those who stood up and discredited the church because some of the things that they've said and done. And I cannot change the media that may or may not, and usually may not, be fair to the church. And I cannot change the world that overgeneralizes that if this person of faith acts this way, they all must act that way. But I'll tell you what I can do. I can work towards seeing that I am growing and that I'm changing. Maybe I'm being a little less of a hypocrite. And maybe I can have a little bit of influence over those who will listen to me and try to lead us in a different direction. So our focus today is going to be more personal than the church as a whole. And I have to admit, confess to the fact that I fail. That I at times become judgmental. And at times I do not live up to the standard that people place on me. And certainly I do not even come up to the standard that I place on myself. I have no excuse. The only thing that I can say is that's not the point of Christianity. Are we any better than the world around? I mean, I've certainly heard that. The church, they're no better than the world around us. And do not Christians live moral, upright lives? Sometimes, absolutely. James chapter 1 says, every good and perfect gift comes down from above. And the simple fact is, there are echoes of the goodness of God still within our creation. And so we have not been fully devastated by the darkness. So many do live good lives. Do Christians fail? The Bible teaches that we will fail, that we will continue to be sinners. And I ran across a statement this week. I've heard it before, but I ran across it again. The church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. Church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. I am so grateful we live by grace. The church is rightly full of people who are insecure, who at times are overly sensitive, who at times lack confidence, and a dozen other things. And it's true. I go to various spots around town. I might ask people, so how are you doing? I go to the rink next door. And here, fine, I'm doing okay. I go to the grocery store, and I can run into people who are doing just great. I can go to all sorts of buildings around town and find people who, if I ask them how they're doing, they're saying good. And then I go over to the hospital. And I go visit patients there. And a lot of them are not doing good. A lot of them are struggling physically. And I look at it and I can be tempted to argue, well, the hospital is a place to bring health and to help people feel well. And if everybody in there is sick, well, that must mean the hospital's a failure. Because I go to other buildings, I go to the rink, everybody's healthy. I go to the grocery store, everybody's healthy. No, Monty, don't. I'm not really blaming the hospital. It's an illustration, though. And I think it catches the idea right. That the church is a place where people understand that they need grace. That this is a place to come and understand that I don't have it all together, that I need the love of God. That maybe this is the one place where we all can fail because we understand that we need Jesus. Problem from the world's point of view, and I get it, is that we talk about morality here. The easy easiest sermon actually to preach is about how the world out there, they're all a bunch of sinners. So many times, preachers have fallen into that trap. And sometimes the world out there knows that people sit in the pews and say, at least in their minds, they won't say this out loud, "Oh, I wish so-and-so was here to hear that." And people know this. They'll say that, "Oh, the church talks about sin," and they'll condemn sin, but they'll still live in it. In other words, people look at us and they rank how good we look compared to themselves and to others, which is exactly what they accuse us of doing. And unfortunately, we too will sit and judge ourselves compared to others who are here, and then we start to think the church is full of hypocrites. Or we compare ourselves to the world, and we smugly condemn. And the problem with this is twofold. Jesus condemns hypocrisy, living one way and believing another. In other words, believing in Jesus but living like I don't. And secondly, it discredits the church and keeps the church from fulfilling its purpose in the kingdom of God. Author John Stott wrote, "Hypocrisy is hideous. What cancer is to the body, hypocrisy is to the church, and is a potent agent. Unfortunately, hypocrisy is also addictive. And even though Jesus reserved his most severe words of condemnation for the hypocrite, we still seem to prefer that lifestyle to truth and authenticity." An author by the name of Barbara Taylor said that sometimes we use language of sin that makes it sound like a sickness, that it's a malady that needs to be fixed. So we come to church thinking that this is a place to fix sin, to fix what is wrong, if it's a medical language. And she says, or we fall into the way of speaking of sin like it's legal language, that sin is a violation of the law, and so we come to church to find ways to avoid breaking the law. Instead, we need to understand that sin it's not a sickness in that same way. It's not a violation of the law in quite the same way. What it really is a wrecked relationship with God. It is a wrecked relationship with God, and even somewhat his creation. Way back in 1849, Christian philosopher Kierkegaard said, "Sin is despair, not wanting to be oneself before God." Not wanting to be oneself before God. To understand, I'm going to give an illustration. And this actually comes from a book that was written about the same time that Kierkegaard said that, a little bit after, by Robert Louis Stevenson. I'm sure we've all heard of it. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Everybody familiar with that one? In the great books of English language. In it, Robert Louis Stevenson writes about this scientist who comes up with a formula, a scientific formula, to bring that which was hidden out into the open. The word Mr. Hyde, or the name Mr. Hyde, some wonder where that name might come from. It just hide, like hidden. Bring out which is hidden. And of course, which was hidden were horrible acts in which, when Dr. Jekyll takes his formula, he is confronted by his deepest, darkest sins. And as they come out, he is horrified, but at the same time finds great pleasure in that which was hidden. But even though he enjoys it, he is horrified by what he finds in the deepest, darkest parts of his heart. So he makes a commitment to himself. I'm not going to take this potion ever again. And I know what the solution is to all these deep, dark things in my heart. I'm going to commit my life to a life of love, to a life of charity, so that I smother what is bad with what is good. I smother what is bad with what is good. So he goes out and he does many, many good acts over the period of a longer period of time. And he goes out for a walk one day in Regent Park in London, and he sits down on a bench and he starts to reflect. And he realizes a lot of the good deeds that he's done. He's devoted his life to charity. He has ended suffering for many. He's relieved suffering at least. And he starts comparing himself to some of his peers and comes to this realization that I am better than most. And this is his quote. I smile comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. Doing well, I've smothered the monster within with goodwill. And then this line. At the very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea, the most dreadful shuddering. I was once more Edward Hyde. What that means, he's kind of describing how the monster came out when he took the potion. And in this moment of realization that, hey, I'm pretty good, I'm doing well, I'm better than other people, all of a sudden, without taking the potion, involuntarily, the monster surfaces again. He has no control. You know he's done something wrong. But pride and self-centeredness have brought out the monster. He is not able to smother the monster with good deeds. I love this quote. Flannery O'Connor. He says he discovered that the best way to avoid Jesus was to avoid sin. The best way to avoid Jesus was to avoid sin. Because if I don't do anything wrong, I don't need Jesus. I don't need Jesus. Even in churches that teach that salvation is by faith in Jesus alone, we tend to judge each other on the basis of certain sins, and we commend ourselves for the lack of some sins. I say I don't gamble, I don't sit at the bar at night, I don't smoke, I don't take drugs. I'm going to tell you that this attitude, which is so easy to fall into, I have fallen into it I don't know how many times, but that attitude is a rejection of the gospel. We tend to put everybody into white hats or black hats. And we tend to do it for ourselves. But it's not real. It's not real. Story of a man who sat through his church service and was not happy. And he went home, and as they were driving home, it was a little bit of a drive, must be in a city, because traffic was bad. He complained about that, he complained about the sermon, he complained about the heat, and he complained about the lateness of the meal that they were going to eat. And his son listened to the whole thing, and then he bowed his head when he was finally ready for lunch, and he said grace. And the young boy said, "Daddy, did God hear you when you left church and you started fussing about the sermon and about traffic and about the heat and about the lack of food?" And the man said, rather meekly, "Well, yeah." "Well, Daddy, did God hear you when you just prayed for this food right now?" "Well, yes, son, he heard me." "So, Daddy, which one did God believe?" See, we all fall into traps. We have a verse that, I haven't come to the Bible yet, better. I had this on the screen earlier. All your words are true. All your righteous laws are eternal. Morality comes, and morality is important, but it comes from first knowing Jesus. I want you to understand that I am not letting people off the hook today for our moral lives. There is truth, there is right and wrong, and it is found in that word that's up there twice, your. Your. It's in something that belongs to you. Something to do with God. It is God's truth. Morality is not based in traditions. It is not in what I emphasize at this moment of what sins are important, which ones are not. Morality is found in one place only, and that is Jesus Christ. It is rooted in knowing our God. Morality is not based in our own ideals, our own cultural understanding, or pressure from people. It is rooted in the eternal. And only when we know Jesus are we led into a lifestyle that we should lead. Because here is the bottom line. We as Christians at times have emphasized sin over forgiveness. We have emphasized judgment over love. We have emphasized our own comfort and traditions over faith. We have fallen into the same traps as everyone else in judging and ranking people on the basis of their morality. Bottom line in two things. We fail like everyone else and we protect our own egos. And secondly, that is no excuse. Somebody's not happy with that. That doesn't mean it's not true, though. We talk often that we kind of have a little bit of a motto for our church, that we are a community church where we grow together. And the reason we have those words is because we are on a journey. We are journeyers. We are not those who have arrived. We are all heading through life together. We struggle with sorrow. We enjoy happiness. And we struggle to put life together. The Pharisees saw themselves as better because they found ways to convince themselves that the sins they cared about and that they worried about, they had put aside, were the best of the best. And people did look up to them. And yet Jesus comes along and he calls them all a bunch of serpents. He says that they are the grave itself. It's so easy to fall into the trap, to not rely on grace, but on my own self, my own morality. There's a story of a church meeting where a wealthy man got up and said, "I'm a millionaire, and I attribute all the rich blessings of God in my life to the faith that I have in Him." And I remember the turning point in my faith. I just earned my first $1. And I went to a church meeting that night. The speaker was a missionary, told about his work. And I knew that I had only $1. And I had to give it all to God's work, or give nothing at all. So at that moment, I decided to give my whole $1 to God. I believe that God has blessed that decision because I gave everything to Him. And that's why I'm a rich man today. He sat down at the end of his testimony, and an old woman stood up and said, "I dare you to do it again." How do we avoid being a Pharisee? And I know, don't worry, I'm going to answer my biggest question of the day. And I know it's getting late, but it's two short answers. They're just hard to live. First, keep focused on Jesus. Worship, prayer, Scripture, we come back to that over and over and over again, but it's always the answer. Keep focused on Jesus. And I'll give you the second way. Serve people. I want to stay away from trying to judge people, serve them. I want to stop ranking people, serve them. Sacrifice. Not looking back and thinking, oh, look how much I sacrifice. But sacrifice with no need for praise. Just giving myself for the sake of others. Because that's what Jesus did, isn't it? We find over and over again in the Gospels, Jesus would sneak off and he'd spend time in prayer. He'd focus himself on the Father, and then he would go and he would serve people. Even to the point of laying down his life to serve others. That's the only way. We look to God and we follow him. Obedience comes from understanding that we are hooked up with a God who is eternal. A God whose words are always true. So we look to him and we commit ourselves again to him. I'm going to invite